Okay, I think it's 12:05, and while people trickle in, I think we'll start so that we have more time for the actual conversation. So, hello everybody, I'm Cynthia Roman, and I am curator of prints, drawings, and paintings at the Lewis Walpole Library, which is a department of the Yale University Library. So first we have a few quick logistics. The program is being recorded and will be made available online. Live captioning is available now by turning on the icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We ask that during the conversation you keep your audio and video off for the panel discussion, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. And you can either raise your hand to ask your own question or use the chat feature. So, okay. Thank you all for joining us today for the first of our series of conversations around the library's online exhibition, William Hogarth's Topographies, which has been curated by Pierre Von-Ow. Our program today is on decolonizing Sámi representations and the legacy of colonial topographies. And we are really happy to have Mathias Danbolt and Joar Nango join us for this. And just a side note that our second program will be a conversation with Jacqueline Riding and Caroline Patey on Hogarth's peregrinations, and that's scheduled for July 20th. So please watch for further on that soon. So we begin today, our program today, with Yale University's approved land acknowledgement statement, with a brief side note that we have had some interesting discussions and even some pushback around the complexities of land acknowledgements, which we might want to talk about later. So here it is. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagosset, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Pierre Von-Ow. Pierre is a PhD candidate in the history of art at Yale University. His research focuses primarily on the intersections of arts and science in the 17th and 18th century British Empire. His current dissertation project explores histories of linear perspective in early modern British art, architecture, and mathematics. His most recent publication is the anthology of Jean-Claude Liebenstein's writings on film, which he co-edited with Enrico Conferesi, and it was published in 2021. Pierre has been a graduate research assistant at the library for 2 semesters, during which he has contributed his creativity insights towards our initiatives to reconsider the imperial legacies of our 18th century British collections across the centuries and across the globe to recover Indigenous perspectives. Forthcoming in spring 2024, Pierre will be editing with Marie Guédon a special issue of the Journal Écrans, and forgive me for my French, Pierre and Caroline, William Hogarth and Cinema. Pierre and Marie are currently accepting submissions, and you can reach out to Pierre and email him. I think Kristen can put his email in the chat now if you have more questions or interest. And before I turn the program over to Pierre to introduce our guests, I want to recognize that exhibitions and programs are highly collaborative efforts, especially challenging in a virtual pandemic world. For this project in particular, I want to call out the Lewis Walpole Library's Susan Walker, Head of Public Services, and Chris McDonald, Public Services Assistant. Thank you to both of you for your unfailing contributions to the research, exhibitions, and programs at the library. Over to Pierre.
Thank you, Cindy, for the introduction. And I also want to extend my thanks to both Susan Walker and Kristen, as well as you, Cindy, for making this exhibition possible, and Nicole, the director of the Lewis Walpole Library, who supported this program. And of course, a particular thanks to both Joar Nango and Mathias Danbolt, who accepted to join us today. I'm very excited for our conversation. So I will briefly introduce our two speakers today, and then I will turn over to Joar, who will shortly present, and then Mathias. And towards the end, I will briefly offer you a run through of like the specific part of the exhibitions that this program, or like this event, is organized in conjunction with. And then we'll open the floor for questions that you can type in the chat, or like you can use the hand raise function to ask your question directly. So Joar Nango was born in 1979 in Alta, Norway, is a Sámi architect and indigenous artist living in Norway. Nango's work investigates the nomadic conception of space, territories, and ideas of the concept of home. He focuses on different ways of dealing with materiality, movement, and space. He has exhibited internationally, both separately and as an individual artist, including at Documenta 14 in 2017, Chicago Architecture Biennale, Institute for Modern Art in Brisbane, National Museum of Canada, Bergen Kunsthall, and National Museum of Norway. He's also involved in collective projects. In 2010, he established the architecture collective FFB, which makes an architecture celebrating the failure of capitalism. Since 2020, he has been involved as a host and director of the ongoing TV production PCA TV, or Post-Capitalist Architecture TV, in which the 6th episode features a commission work for Toronto Biennale of Art in May 2022. Mathias Danbolt is a Norwegian art historian who has a special focus on queer, feminist, and decolonial perspectives on art and visual culture. Danbolt is currently leading 3 collective research projects, one entitled The Art of Nomadic Colonialism, Writing Transcultural Art Histories, another called Octa, Art and Social Communities in Sápmi, and finally, Moving Monuments, the Afterlife of Sculpture from the Danish Colonial Era. In 2017, Danbolt curated the visual culture exhibition Blind Spots, Images of the Danish West Indies colony, with Mette Kia Krabbemeyer and Sarah Giersing at the Royal Danish Library. Danbolt is professor of art history at the University of Copenhagen. And so without further ado, I turn it to you, Joar, for the first presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you to everyone involved in inviting us here. It's a very exciting project you have going on, and I look forward to hear more about the ongoing research dealing with that. It's a very important topic to discuss. My point of departure today will, of course, be to talk about my art practice and show some artworks that specifically deals with representation and also with sort of architectural history of the Sámi culture and the Sámi land, where I come from and where I currently is. So I'm a Sámi architect, as you said, Pierre, and I live in a town called Tromsø, which is in the very heart of Sápmi, the region of Northern Europe. So the Sámi traditional lands are in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, and Tromsø is in the very middle of our territory. So Mathias will be showing some slides for us today. So you can just skip the slide now, Mathias. Yeah. So I like to when I do a presentation of my projects, I sometimes really enjoy sort of being a bit personal and sort of also pulling things really far back in time. So this is actually a project that's more than 15 years old already, and it was a part of actually my graduating thesis as an architect from NTNU in Trondheim. And it's a small fanzine dealing with Sámi architecture. At that time, I was, as a student, I was, like many other Sámis, I think, kind of disappointed by the sort of ruling institution that I was attending and their lack of knowledge about indigenous issues, and especially Sámi architecture was a field that was not spoken about at all. The little things that was spoken about Sámi architecture was very much framed by this sort of folkloristic type of dimension where we as a culture were presented as something in the past, something that already belonged to the reign of the museums. And I was provoked by that, and I wanted to create a discussion that sort of addressed that. I wanted to open up, of course, a conversation that could invite other Sámis and other Sámi artists and architects into sort of a more of an autonomously owned type of discussion. So it made sense to make a zine, make a magazine. And of course, zine was the preferred format also, since my economy at that time was very low and I didn't have a budget at all for this project. So it came out in 3 issues and I kept it going for 1.5 years. Sorry, 4 issues. Yeah, that you see the 3 first ones here. And they're basically dealing with 3 things. So one is the research on the institutional architecture that's built in Sápmi, and the way architects, because none of these buildings have been built by Sámi people. So it's usually other people, Norwegians or Swedes or people from the outside, sort of people that come into our communities to design. So I was looking at how institutional architecture was built for Sámi communities, schools, healthcare centers, parliament buildings, cultural centers, and these type of buildings. And the second thing I looked at was sort of being a bit of a self-anthropologist. I was researching, how the built environment in Sápmi could sort of be a source of potential for new type of architecture. And the third one was the traditional architecture. So looking backwards in time into indigenous building practices. And then the next slides. So during my research on the institutional architecture, something became very clear to me, and that was what was that many designers that had sort of been invited into Sámi community have sort of done a bit, sort of used the same type of design strategy, which was to take the very iconic and recognizable and famous building typology, the building structure, the lavvo, which is very much similar to the North American teepee. So it's a conical shaped tent used by the nomadic reindeer herders. And as we will see later on, when we look at Hogarth's paint drawings and paintings, and also Knut Lem, which we'll hear more about, you will see that these buildings have become very iconic as representations of Sámi culture. And many of the architects have sort of that came from the outside. They took that very sort of easily accessible type of visual information, and they have started to design, sort of a modern building based on that sort of traditional form and symbolic type of shape aesthetic. And it was done to such a large extent that it was almost a little bit it's quite surprising, I would say, to realize that almost half of all the institutional buildings that were designed were still designed with this sort of lavvo aesthetical role model or starting point. So I realized that it was almost like a syndrome happening amongst the sort of Western European architects designing for my indigenous culture. And I started to frame it as a giant lavvo syndrome in a little bit humorous way, describing how this appearing indigenous typology was in so many ways exotifying my culture in terms of representation, and also on an architectural point of view was also sort of losing out on a lot of interesting potential and concepts that lies within our built environment and our sort of cultural tradition, dealing with local materials and many different concepts in architecture. So if you continue, so continuing sort of my research on Sámi architecture, I zoom forward 12, 13 years in time, and all of a sudden I'm realizing that I have become sort of all the material that I have gathered through all my research. I've been to Australia, I've been to Mongolia, a lot in Canada, Nunavut, Greenland, working also with other indigenous groups, networking and teaching and sort of building this like large conversation around indigenous architecture, also on an international level, I sort of realized that all these materials that I gather, all the books, all the Xerox copied articles that I found in strange rare books, and all the stuff I gathered from internet also was becoming an archive. So in 2018, 4 years ago already, I decided to make this archive public. So I made a small Sámi architectural library that's called Girjegumpi, and I built it in this small, as you can see in the image here, inside a small nomadic hut that can be pulled by snowmobile on snow, which is a commonly used vernacular structure within reindeer herding and in the area where I'm from, where my family, Sámi family, is from, and this is called a gumpi. Girje, so the project is called Girjegumpi. So it's a combination of two words. Gumpi is the name of this structure, and Girje is the Sámi name for a book. So as a sort of performative act and a 2-week-long performance, we built this structure as a part of a festival in the north called Festspillene in Nord-Norge. And we also had seminars and workshops where we were teaching traditional Sámi building techniques to bypassers and people that could attend. And it was like the first starting point for Girjegumpi, which has since then just escalated and grown in size. And it has traveled the north for 5 years now. It has just been at the National Museum of Architecture in Oslo. It's in Kiasma, the Contemporary Museum of Art in Helsinki right now. And it had also made its way over the Atlantic to the National Gallery of Canada. So it's a project that somehow has grown in size, and it keeps growing and it's alive. And one of the really important things for this project is, of course, that it's small and nomadic, and it can travel to very, very regional spots like this, like you see Jokkmokk here. It's a small Swedish, sort of this is one of the centers of the Sámi population on the Swedish side. Is they have every year a winter market, and in this image it's minus 28 degrees. So it's a small sort of self-sufficient type of structure that can, you know, reach far and travel easily. Yeah, one of the main also important things for me with this project is that it can invite in other Sámi architects. So we have had, every time it's installed, I have the sort of ambition of making a seminar. So making a seminar or some sort of a discursive type of format where Sámi architects or designers are invited in to share space and talk and develop, of course, network, but also develop each other's thinking around Sámi architecture and what it is. Yeah, so there's many different categories of the books. Now I think the library itself contains more than 500 books. There's a lot of traditional, very rare material about indigenous architecture, of course, mostly Sámi, but then there's also a lot of contemporary, more philosophical type of literature that deals with, for example, decolonization or dissensus, like you see here from Chakrans. Yeah. So yeah, so it's a combination, a bit eccentric combination of contemporary and historical type of sources within this archive. Yeah, so continuing. Yeah, maybe we skip this. It's a sort of a project that I did in continuation of my research on the institutional architecture and the giant level syndrome. And my interest in duodji, which is the Sámi handcraft, has sort of always been there. My father is a doyer, so he works, you know, I grew up with the reindeer antlers and wood being formed into knives and cups around the kitchen table. And so it's for me, it has, you know, it has a very important part in my life, and it's something that I considered very much Sámi and very much something that's autonomously owned by us, but something that's also very I was thinking about it as a potential for how architecture somehow can learn from duodji. Duodji, it's not translatable into art. I think duodji is as a sort of concept is something that's much more in between art or art and craft in a way. So I've been using a lot of effort to make the Girjegumpi project into this, like, at the same time as a discursive hub dealing with, you know, decolonial issue, trying to form network and conversation around what Sámi architecture is. I also try to sort of leave spaces for for where space and materials can also be experimented with in the same way. So very collectively, I've been sort of diving into different type of traditional architectural formats and experimenting with doyars. So I always invite doyars, and one of them you see on this image, her name is Katarina Spikskum, and she has become my collaborator in Girjigumpi now, and for many years she has been working with Dorji in a very experimental way, and she's a true artist and a great collaborator. So every time I do Girjigumpi, I invite Katarina to experiment with different type of forms and symbols, and she's a very interesting, talented artist to work with. So next, here you see some of her wonderful work, of course. And then for just to sum up now, I think I'm reaching 10 minutes here. So just to sum up, I wanted to show this work, which I think is somehow very interesting in terms of the topic of today's talk, about William Hogarth and this like sort of traditional type of imagery. And for the project, for a big exhibition where Girjigumpi was present in Bergen Kunsthal in, what was that, 2020, so 2 years ago almost, I invited Katarina to come and work over these old images from Knut Lem, which Mathias will tell you more about later. Mathias, I remember Mathias and me have been in touch quite a bit, talking, of course, and also more and more collaborating around different type of Sámi art discussions, you could say. And I remember Mathias told me about these images that he had found in the Royal Danish Library, which he will tell you more about later, which was from the mid 18th century, so 1760s, and they were not really published before, and they're made by a missionary called Knut Lem. And these images are for me very, very familiar, because all of the literature that is there's very little literature produced on Sámi architecture, but some is produced, but all of the literature that's produced are using these images as the sort of first visual representation of Sámi architecture. On this image, you see a lavvo. In the back to the right, you see a beljegoti, which is another type of tent construction used by Sámis. And to the upper left corner, yeah, you will see sort of an illustration of how the traditional plan and the cultural use of this type of buildings were. So these are extremely pedagogical paintings and drawings made by Knut Lem, that's following his book from 1767. And for me, it was really interesting to sort of try and use this imagery that was not reproduced, the colored versions of this imagery that Mathias had found, and to put them into more of a sort of a Sámi context. How can we take these images and sort of reintroduce them into our world, into our built cultural autonomous environment in a way? So what we did was that we took this traditional we have inside our lavvos, inside these tent structures, we have a tradition of using what we call a rahkas, which is kind of like an inner tent, which is usually sewn by old bedcloth, by light cotton fabric, so people could have some privacy within the tent, and also to have protection against smoke and mosquitoes. So it's a very practical thing that's still in use today. But what we did was that we sort of took these images from Knut Lem and we printed them on fabric, and then we combined and sort of composed this very colorful, kind of playful, small inner tents sewn in a very traditional Sámi way. Sort of in that way, sort of taking something from the sort of colonial history of the Norwegian Danish missionaries and reintroducing them into our more contemporary vernacular type of architecture. And that's a recipe that we are still working with, and me and Katarina have done similar projects later on. And here you see an image from the National Museum of Architecture, which was from last year, where we did a big exhibition of Girjigumpi in the Sverre Fehn designed pavilion, which was a very interesting project, that is still developing. So I think I'll leave the torch to Mathias then. And of course, I look forward to speak more over or answer questions or anything later.
Thank you so much, Joar, for that. And thank you also to Pierre and Cynthia for the invitation to come and share our work here today. So as Pierre mentioned in the introduction, my name is Mathias Danbolt, and I'm an art historian from Norway, but have been living in Denmark for the last 15 years, actually. And so I'm coming from a different place, both disciplinary, but as well as I think kind of, many ways from Joar, given that I'm not an indigenous artist or scholar, but I'm a settler scholar. I'm from Norway, which is still a settler colonial state in the sense that it is still having a colonial relationship to the territories of the Sámis. And coming out of art history, discipline that has been part of a nation building process from the start, I've been interested in work for the last almost a decade on trying to examine the contact zones between art history and colonial history in the Nordic context. And one of my entry points to this specific topic of today, of the legacy of colonial topographies, started in the National Museum of Copenhagen, in the ethnographic collection. Because in the corner of the ethnographic collection in the National Museum of Copenhagen, which is a really, really huge collection, I came across a series of paintings in the corner. You can see them here in this installation shot. There's 2 vitrines with 4 Sámi sacred drums and other kind of doji material in reindeer antler horn. And behind that, in the kind of dark corner behind a door, there were these paintings. There were 35 of them all in all, 16 up, and I came across them quite a few years ago, and I was really, really curious to why these paintings were here. And the only material that was said about these paintings was that it was a series of 35 paintings that the Danish King Frederick V commissioned by his court painters in 1748, Johannes Rasch and Hans Henrik Egeberg, that the king commissioned his court painters to paint 35 paintings from the Sámi, of the everyday life of the Sámis. That was the only information given on the wall. And the exhibition did not say anything about the Sámis in general. It didn't even have any kind of introduction text as to how come this material was there, what the Sámi history was in relationship to Denmark. There were just these kind of paintings that in many ways function merely as a backdrop to the exhibition of the white Danish museum director, Rane Willerslev, on his an exhibition about his explorer research trip and his private collection of Arctic ethnographica. So these Sámi paintings were merely kind of a backdrop, a silent backdrop, without any kind of context. So that was kind of my question: why in the world would the king in Denmark commission his court painters to paint all this? And that kind of led me into a longer process of trying to find out and entangle the question of the interest in Copenhagen and the part of Denmark and Copenhagen, the part of the colonization process of the Sámi territories that started back in the kind of 14th, 15th, 16th century, but that really, really intensified in the 18th century when the king commissioned these paintings. Turning, as you usually do when you try to have a research question, you turn to literature, and the Danish colonial historians have been writing quite a lot as of late, and there recently came a 5-volume books about the Danish colonial histories and specifically the territories in West Africa, in today's Ghana and the West Indies, the today's US Virgin Islands that used to be under Danish and Norwegian flags for 250 years, the colonies in Greenland and in India. But in this 2,500-page book, the Sámi territories is not even mentioned, except for this tiny reference to the so-called inner colonization of the north of Norway in the preface of the book, in a description of why that doesn't really count as a proper colony, because it was not far from the motherland. It was always the inner part of the nation. A reference then in itself kind of excludes even an analysis of the colonization of Sápmi as a colonial process. So that kind of reference, the kind of colonial ignorance, the kind of the structured unknowing about the colonial past, that in many ways have helped, I guess, to produce a more comfortable narrative of the nation, has been kind of a structuring problem when trying to find out more about these specific paintings. and thus about the colonial history between Copenhagen and the Sámi territories. But digging in the archives, a lot of material, of course, came up. And in many ways, you can say that the Sámis have had an enormous important role in Denmark-Norway's kind of territorial history and history of trade and history of colonial extraction of values and goods. And you find a lot of Sámi material has been part of the Danish royal collections from its start in the 17th century. As you see here in this little frontispiece from Museum Regium, the book of Frederick III's collection. And trying to kind of dig through, I came across one of the sources and one of the reasons behind this series of paintings, which led me into the history of the mission and the history of the missionary, the Danish mission in the Sámi territories. And as with a lot of missionary history, the mission has seldom only been about religion. Religion has been one kind of string in a series of different forms of power dynamics. And specifically pertaining to the Sámi mission, the Danish mission of the Sápmi, this history was deeply entangled in an attempt to gain access and to gain territorial rights over the Sámi territories from Sweden, who was also very interested in these areas in the northern peninsula of Fenno-Scandinavia that had not only a lot of valuable materials in terms of silver and mining potential, but also the different forms of furs and other things that the Sámi were trading and selling. So the Danish mission intensified a lot because Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had been fighting for over a couple of centuries over where to put the border between the nations. And that border was set in the middle of the 18th century in 1751. And up to that border negotiation that lasted for many years, Frederick V, the king, sent his missionaries out to produce colonial knowledge about Sápmi, knowledge that was to be used in this argument and trying to argue and fight for the territorial rights of the Sámi people. And Knut Lem was one of these missionaries who were sent in the 1720s at first and lived 9 years among the Sámi in the northern part of Finnmark. And during that time, he produced a numerous amount of material. And maybe the most important book came out quite late in 1767, as mentioned, which is called The Description of the Sámis in Finnmark. And this book, which is more than 500-page book, it's a huge tome that was produced in both Danish and Latin, included 101 copper etchings that describes the way Sámi lived, their building, and their way of tending to reindeer, their way of fishing, etc. And these copper etchings has been very much circulated and have been quite important because this book has been such an important source for knowledge, kind of colonial knowledge about the Sámis, not only during its time, but also in the time afterwards. Because Knut Lem, even though he was part of the colonial project, since he had been a missionary in Sápmi in the 1720s, that was a time where the missionaries were asked to actually learn Sámi language. So he was a language very well versed in Northern Sámi. And thus, he actually had another opportunity to be able to speak with people and understand their way of life and their culture. So in relationship to a lot of the material and a lot of the histories and knowledge produced through some of the other famous kind of scientists, missionaries, explorers at the time, such as Johannes Schäferus, which the Swedish or the Swedish-based historian that wrote the important book Laponia in the 1670s. He had never visited the Sámi territories, and Knut Lem, in the introduction to his book, makes that very clear, that he is actually one of the first people writing about the Sámi who has lived among the Sámi and who knew their language and did actually then write from a different place. But the images in the book is coming from another kind of place, because Knut Lem was not an artist himself. So he had, he commissioned an artist to live with him for over a year to make drawings and paintings that could be based and sent to the copper etcher in Copenhagen. We don't exactly know who these artists or the artists are. I've been looking in archives and I've not been able to find the name. But I do think that the artist that lived with the missionary, not in Sápmi, but when he lived in further south in Norway, was one of these two men that we see in this picture, Johannes Rasch, one of the two court painters who later on were commissioned by the king to paint these 35 paintings. So Knut Lem wrote this monumental manuscript in the 1740s and came to Copenhagen in 1748 and gave them to King Frederick V in order to get them published. And with them, he also gave the king an illustrated manuscript with these 99 at that time watercolor sketches. These sketches were then given to the copper etcher much later, and the copper etchings are well known. But when I started to dig into this history, I came across this manuscript in the archives. And this manuscript have not been published before. It isn't to say that nobody has looked at it, but it has not been written almost anything about it. And I was extremely fascinated by these pictures, these illustrations, because in contrast to the paintings that you have, or no, the copper etchings that we have in the printed book that are made by copper etcher Hendrik von Lode, who was a classical trained copper etcher in the tradition more of the Renaissance kind of perspective. These illustrations in the original handwritten manuscript are a very different kind because they do not attempt to create or to set the Sámi's way of living in the same kind of topographical space, nor in the kind of topographical correct perspective than we see in the copper etchings. They are so to speak, much more kind of simple, but not in that way simplistic, because their attention and their interest is very clear insofar as they really are an attempt to try to understand the way the Sámis lived and worked and built. So in the almost 35 of these paintings describe the architectural structure of Sámi dwellings. And here you see one of these, the Beljegoti, one of the huts that also Joar was talking about earlier. And these are really interesting because they have double or triple kind of perspectives. You see things from above, but you also see things from the side and sometimes also from underneath, almost in the same painting, as a way to try to create a sense of structure and space. And when I found these imagery, I of course immediately had to contact Joar Nango because I knew that Joar was working with Sámi architecture, and I thought that these images potentially had some kind of knowledge within them, even though they are, of course, grounded in a colonial knowledge production that could be maybe of interest and maybe of use, because they have a different character than the etchings that have circulated, and because they also were coming out, or maybe I think they're made in a way that suggests that they might be able to be seen more as a kind of a pictogrammatic kind of dictionary or diary, both to learn the Sámi language and to understand their way of life. So when you read them in relation to the text in the book, you would also see quite quickly that Knut Lem is very particular in trying to describe all the different elements of the structure in Sámi language. So the book in itself, seen together with specifically these unpublished drawings that have a much more detailed attention to the structure of the buildings, potentially could be, I thought, a source that could maybe tell us something about Sámi architecture from a different perspective. Now, to return then to the paintings for just 1 minute before I will round off. The artists who then got the commission, these two Rococo court painters, had never visited Sápmi, but I think one of them was living with a missionary in southern Norway for a while. But these painters are quite famous in Denmark for their topographic views of the Copenhagen city's landscape in the 1740s, because they were commissioned by the king to paint approximately 170 images of how Copenhagen looks today. And in Danish art history, these are not known as artists as such, but as topographers. And as one art historian notes here, that none of these artists deserves to be remembered for their artistic contributions. Their role as topographic mediators are, with reservation of other importance. So while the paintings they are known for, at least, are seen to have a kind of a topographic interest, the paintings, in the little that have been written about them, have been just kind of dismissed as Arctic fairy tale images. And, you know, that might be an understandable framework. There is definitely kind of similarities between, for instance, how the reindeers are made, and that kind of describes the kind of fairy tale nature. I'm thinking of Frozen #1, for instance. You can get kind of, you know, the sense of that. And in many ways, the paintings are inscribing themselves in a long history of what the art historian Eli Høydalsnes has called a kind of a Sámi iconography that can be tracked back to the 16th century, with certain kind of images of the Sámi have been very persistent. At the same time, there is a sense that these paintings and also the drawings, because they seem to be so naive or simplistic, that they're kind of overlooked the both art historical and the aesthetic nature of them, that we kind of have forgotten to look at them as images and how they work. Because of course, both the paintings, I think, is very much in dialogue with art history, and is very definitely kind of drawing on other kinds of artistic traditions, whilst I think these drawings maybe are drawing on other forms of traditions of more, as I said, kind of a pictogrammatic imagery that is attempts to try to tell us something, not so much about topography and space, but about the function of buildings and the function and understanding of Sámi ways of life. And so, of course, you have, like, we are left then with these three very different sets of imagery of Sápmi, none of which really speaks to the landscape as such, and none, maybe that probably even to talk about topographies might be challenging, but still they do offer us, I think, some opportunities to think through and ask questions about both, or not only, the colonial function of imagery and how imagery has been central to the creation of a sense of Sápmi, and but also how these colonial imageries and different traditions for colonial image productions might also be gleaned from other kinds of material today, and how they might also be used creatively to kind of rethink and remake and kind of reclaim perhaps a Sámi history from some other perspectives. And I think we can see some of the iconography in different contemporary Sámi artists. I think if you look at an artist like Britta Malakat-Labba's work, the Sámi artist who is now also exhibited at the Venice Biennial, I do think some of her way of structuring her pictures is kind of picking up, maybe unintentionally, some of the iconography from Knut Lem's, at least his printed book. But then the collaboration with Joar, to me, was interesting, because since these pictures are based in Denmark still, in the Colonial archives. I was interested in trying to, or think that we need to kind of end this circle of art historians or missionaries or researchers going abroad and kind of extracting knowledge and putting it back to the Colonial Center for it to do some work. How can we today try to do something else with this material? So when I found this material, the first thing I did, as I said, was to call Joar and get him to Copenhagen. And that started kind of another part of our collaborative discussion, where we started to digitize this manuscript, which then again led over to the work that Joar has been doing together with Katarina Spick-Skum on making rakkas. So this was kind of a tiny brief slice of some of the work that we have been doing, and maybe an example of one way that we can try to think of how colonial knowledge production that is so compromised in many of its way, both in terms of production and circulation often, but how it also can create a foundation kind of materially here to something new, to kind of both a reinvention and a reclaiming of Sámi history and Sámi architecture as I think Joar and Katarina demonstrates with the piece, the Rakkas, that so explicitly uses this material to create a new kind of dwelling, a new kind of then image of Sámi architecture today. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. That was fascinating. I will try to give a brief overview of the exhibition in conclusion, because I think it speaks to both of your presentations and like respond to it in such a nice and rich way. So let me share my screen. So yeah, just for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the online exhibition yet, just the way I thought about it, or like the incentive that Cindy, Sue, and Kristen had, was like to look at Hogarth outside of London. And, you know, because Hogarth has been associated with London primarily in the existing literature, and we wanted to build on like recent efforts that have been made to look at Hogarth in a more international context, and especially Hogarth in Europe at Tate, but not only. Topography here, responding to what Mathias was reflecting upon, topography was understood in the broad definition that was given by Dr. Johnson's Canonical Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1755, and which actually defines topography in a very broad way as description of particular places. And although there's a very short definition, I think the word description here is absolutely crucial, because a description involves the transcription, it involves a transfer, manipulation, and in other words, it's definitely not a given, but it's a construction and a representation. So the exhibition itself has three different sections that look at three lesser known projects of Hogarth that are in the Lewis Walpole Library's collections. And I will just focus here on the first of them, which is entitled Travels. And I have to say, I was not planning to end up in Scandinavia when I first thought about this project on William Hogarth and topography, but here we are. So the point of departure was this illustration of Sápmi, which was then known as Lapland, that Hogarth designed to illustrate the travels through Europe, Asia, and into parts of Africa by a French explorer named Aubry de la Mottrais. So these travels were published in like 1723, and Hogarth was not the only one to illustrate or like to provide illustrations and plates for this book. But he was extremely young, and this image in particular is meant to illustrate the 12th chapter, which narrates a trip that La Mottrais made to Sápmi in 1718 at his own initiative. So of course, Hogarth never traveled to Sápmi. He actually barely ever left England, as he was very proud to tell throughout his entire life. And my interest in in front of this image, which is quite curious in his entire production, was to understand maybe more the position that it has in a longer and broader history of representations of Sápmi that you've now been given an introduction to, thanks to both Joar and Mathias. And so I looked at earlier sources, and I found, Johannes Schäfer's The History of Lapland. So the book, as Mathias said, was published in 1670s, but it was translated in 1704 in English, and La Mottrais actually mentions John Schäfer, as he was known in England, as one of his sources. And the History of Lapland was one of the first main big attempt to gather as much information as possible on Lapland, its inhabitants, and its customs. And so it's quite obvious when we flip through the book that Hogarth might certainly have seen the illustrations included, like the woodcuts included in Johannes Scheffer's book, as we can see here with the lavu, but also the little storage house that is perched on a tree trunk, which is like certainly copied from there and adapted slightly. And so he did with the profile of the reindeer, which is almost exactly the same, and certainly took inspiration for the clothing from this book as well. So I think throughout this section more broadly, and like seeing some of those elements, the reindeer, the lavu, and other elements, I was just curious to understand how do stereotypes, visual stereotypes, emerge and solidify. I was not really concerned about like finding the representation or like the genuine source of all these images, but rather to look at the transfers, to look at the migrations between different media and different images. And so for that, I think one of the elements that was the most telling, and of course, quite seductively so, because it's a sledge. This is the Sámi on a sledge, like, and pulled by a reindeer. So exactly as for the previous elements, I think Hogarth was actually drawing inspiration from Schefferus, but he was not the only one at the time. And if we look at some other documents here, it's a small element taken from a big map, a new map of Denmark and Sweden by Hermann Moll, who was a German printmaker who had like produced a huge number of maps at the time, including some maps for like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And so he included what is a direct copy of Schefferus, but we see it also on the frontispiece to the book of Carl von Linné, Flora Laponica, published in 1737, which is an inventory of like all the flora that he found in Sápmi. And finally, we see it in another print that this one is included in the show, and to which I will return in a second, which is by Isaac Robert Cruikshank, that represents what was then known as the Lapland exhibition. But the thing I want to say about this is just that we have here like 5 different genres. We have travel literature with Lamotré on the left. We have a history of the region by Schefferus. We have a map with Hermann Moll. We have a book of natural history with Linné and a caricature with Cruikshank. So following one motif, I was interested to just like travel through a wide range of knowledge production that was then intimately connected to various Western ambitions to capitalize on the resources of this region. And so going back to Cruikshank and the Lapland exhibit, this is another print that is included in the show that deals with this event that happened in 1822. It was organized by Mr. Bullock, William Bullock, who was an entrepreneur and a showman in London at the time, who organized at the Egyptian Hall what was called as the Lapland exhibit, in which he capitalized on a rising interest for Nordic territories in England, especially following Sir John Ross's polar exhibition that had been widely covered in the news in 1818. And among various different elements, you can see that the exhibition included a Sámi family with Jens Holm and his wife Carina Christian and their 4-year-old son here in the middle of the print. Unfortunately, I shall say this was neither the first nor the last time that Sámi were exhibited in England. There was another, much later, exhibition of a Sámi family at the Royal Anthropological Institute in London in 1885, but also some other before. And alongside them, Bullock had brought a herd of reindeer, of which he had much hope about because he wanted to breed them in England. One of the key selling points, and I think that's an important one for this exhibition, according to Bullock, was the panoramic view of that you can see in the background of Rawlinson's caricature here. It was a panoramic view that was advertised at the time as a panoramic view of the North Cape that was presumably replicated from a landscape made on site by a British explorer named Arthur de Capelbroek. So the Lapland exhibition, is a testimony to this confusion that is typical of Bullock, but not only at the time, between ethnography and entertainment, in which informative content served often as an alibi. But as we can see here, it was definitely leaning rather towards, a cheap kind of spectacle with the decor in the background. That was actually naturalized by Bullock on the frontispiece of his little booklet that he sold to the visitors of the Lapland exhibit, in which he described various aspects of the Sámi culture, and long pages were devoted to the reindeer, which, as I said, he hoped to breed in England for both transportation purposes, but also for their meat, for their fur, and various other fantastic projects that actually did not materialize because the entire herd of reindeer sadly died after a couple of weeks in London. And finally, I want to finish with this element because that's the last item in the exhibition. It's the frontispiece for the first French edition of Lamotre's Travels, which was published in The Hague in 1727. So Bernard Picard, who actually engraved this frontispiece, had depicted Sápmi for another large and quite well-known project, which are the ceremonies and religious customs of the various nations of the world. In the 7th volume, an entire chapter was devoted to Sápmi. And in this specific frontispiece, which was engraved four years after the initial publication of Hogarth's print in Lamotre's English version, he combined different elements from the different illustrations in the book. And Hogarth's view of Sápmi was shrunk, as you can see here, and was facing then Constantinople with what resembles cypresses in the background. It recedes the reason I wanted to end the exhibition on that is because through the inclusion of Hogarth's view of Sápmi in this frontispiece, it recedes literally as a distant memory, as a vague evocation of a region that was more fantasized than actually represented correctly. And the print itself, which is, at the beginning or at the point of departure of this exhibition, is not even the copy at the Lewis Walpole Library, is not even in the book anymore. It's actually a print that has been excerpted, and it is now part of a collection of Hogarth's prints. So it's detached also from the textual anchor. And just like the rest of the elements that I have been dealing with was traveling independently as a visual form. And it speaks also, I hope, to my general ambition in this section, which is to study topography not as an accurate landscape or report, but as a sort of concretion or accumulation over time and across images of elements that end up metonymizing, signifying a territory and a culture, such as the reindeer, the lavu, the sledge, and the skis. So we'll end here. I will stop sharing. I have questions for both Mathias and Joar, but since we are already a little bit over time, I would like to just open up the floor for eventual questions from the audience. Well, maybe while people gather their thoughts, I wanted to ask you your feeling, because I mean, throughout the preparation of this exhibition, I'm not, of course, a historian of Sámi art or Scandinavian art, and so I was wondering about the legacy of these images and the way they were perceived today, and so I see that through the project that you did with Mathias, and the reappropriation of Knut Lem's images, like there is a possibility of reading such images against the grain. I'm also aware that Knut Lem's production is like slightly different in the sense that he traveled there, that he actually learned the language, and that it's like a more faithful reproduction of, or like representation of Sápmi. But like, yeah, I was just curious to know like how you felt about Hogarth's representation compared to that.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. Thank you for your question and nice lecture. I think for me, you know, Hogarth and Schäferus and these drawings they're also circulated in, you know, contemporary time Sámi academia, you could say. But I think Knut Lem's imagery are so detailed, and you know, there follows a little in the sort of text to each pictogram, to each image. So I think that has sort of reached a lot further into contemporary Sámi culture, and also you could say modern Sámi academia. And what's really interesting is that many of these images are, you know, they have been so much circulated within academia that you often see them illustrating something completely different than they originally were talking about. For example, you could easily see one of the images of Knut Lem just on the front cover of a book about something Sámi related that aren't necessarily addressing the image itself and the pictogram and the sort of topic of that specific narrative. So I think that's I think that in itself is quite interesting, and it says a lot about, you know, we are people that got our first written historical sources very late. So these are, you know, they have become very important as these elements that somehow these like historical elements that really show our presence. And that is a feature of our culture, is that, you know, we are a nomadic culture, and we have also therefore not built monuments in the same way as many of the neighboring Western cultures have. So I think that has left us a little bit vulnerable in terms of, you know, historically being able to prove our presence in the landscape up here. So in that sense, I think that they are also very important as some kind of proof. And you know, we are still to this day being, you know, pushed away from our traditional land areas, and we're still very much under a colonial type of reality, living in a colonial reality where our resources and our land areas are, you know, they're shrinking every day due to, you know, the Norwegian and the Swedish and the nation states colonial, you know, resource extractive project. So I think that we really need this type of historical proofs also. At the same time, they also, you know, they also show how, for example, Christianity and missionaries and how religious institutions have been sort of in the very, very forefront of reaching into Sámi culture and sort of colonizing us, and all that, the darkness that came with that also. So there's various takes on it, but I think they are extremely important sources, and they're circulating, and they're in use, and very many people, Sámi people, know them, also non-academics. Yeah.
Thank you, Joar. I see in the chat that Sophie Alex has questions. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask them directly?
So I have worked on the Japonica fonts of the family, a Fellman family. I'm trying to find the link. It has been published by the Finno-Ugrian Society. The main title is multilingual, because the society was at first Finnish and French. So they asked me to make a French title, which is a little strange. And in that book, you find mention of very, very many books, travel books. And I would like to ask to Mathias, did you read better the book of Olaus Magnus? You have showed his map, which is an incredible source of interest, historical details. You have shown only a little part of it.
Yes.
And the whole book was published before Schaeffer's one. It was very much criticized, but Olaus Magnus had traveled in Sápmi. He was forced to leave Sweden, as you may know. Others do not know about it. So the book was published in Rome, the first edition. And Schaeffer was asked to come to Sweden later, and he was asked to make corrections on Olaus Magnus' book. And I think he had used a lot Olaus Magnus' books, pictures on it.
Yes, no, but thank you for bringing Olaus Magnus. You know, if we had more time, we could go into all of these different sources for a long time. And you know, the Olaus Magnus book was finally published in Swedish translation, I think last year for the first time.
Only last year.
Yeah, I think so. You know, that's a very interesting source, and there's a lot to say about how different iconographies, just also as PF showed, right, is picking up quite early, and they have many different histories, and they're being taken up. And definitely Olaus Magnus's book has also been circulating in Denmark in the 18th century.
It was published in German, in French, in English.
Yes. So it's
that's why I'm so surprised it was translated so late in Swedish.
Yeah, it's so definitely there are a lot of these important texts that I think have set certain frameworks, both visually and textually, for the knowledge production of Sápmi. I think my interest in particular has not only been in that knowledge as such, but in its kind of political and strategic use at the time, and you know, and how knowledge has also been framed through colonial processes. So the Knut Lem book is interesting in that regard, because he gives the manuscript to the king in 1748, but the censorship system in Denmark sits with the manuscript for 19 years, because he asked them to remove every information in the book that has anything to do with Swedish Sámis, because the book in itself is supposed to be used as an argument in the border treaty negotiation. So to have anything about the Swedish Sámi is kind of messing it up. So even, you know, so we see how kind of colonial processes of land.
How in the war Finno-Scandinavia, you use the term Finno-Scandinavia because Finland is not in Scandinavia, but we have the truth and the reconciliation process starting on with a lot of difficulties. And we are looking at those illustrations. I have in my hand a copy of the dissertation on Lapland, which was published in an historical atlas in French. I tried to show, if you can see, that it was cut off the whole atlas. And I can send you the information, you can find it. And there is also a lot of illustration you may find in other Schaeffers. And they were all over used in others' books. That atlas was published in Amsterdam.
Yes.
We have made a facsimile in Helsinki when I was living in Helsinki.
Thank you for sharing that. I think now Cynthia also had a question, maybe.
I do. Thank you both, actually all three of you, for really wonderful presentations. I was wondering about the intersection of the discipline of art history and the colonial sort of project. And by extension, these judgments about quality and what's good and what's bad. And in museums where something is great art and you cannot touch it, versus, and I'm thinking of the paintings, Mathias, that you found hidden in the corner, but they're still in that sort of precious museum setting. And I was thinking about yours sort of traveling archive, and I was really wondering about the opportunities for people who come to those events to engage. Are they allowed to touch? And I'm just thinking about the different ways of knowledge that you can engage with haptically versus visually, and that kind of access or barrier. Anyway.
You should start.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting question, and obviously also something that for me as an artist and an architect, I'm producing space, I'm not producing, history or texts, although sometimes that also, but for me, the sort of interaction between people and also of course, the sort of participatory dimension of everything I do is really, really important. So Girigumpi is exactly that. And I think in one way, it's also a very sort of conscious attempt to try and comment on how art institution negotiate architectural history, and how they frame it and how it's presented and how it is interacted with. So Girigumpi is it's a place where you're absolutely invited in to pick up a book and read a book, and also leave a book behind. I haven't figured out a system for how to sort of rent out books yet, but it's going to come as the project is still growing and larger institutions are interested in it. So that's really, for me, it's very interesting and important to do. And I work like aesthetically and architecturally really a lot with that type of generosity as an aesthetical concept. So coming into the installation, you're supposed to feel welcome. You're supposed to feel a warmth. You're supposed to really, find your own way into it. And I think that a lot of exhibition design, and of course also how institutions are working with it, they are alienating audiences instead of sort of inviting them in a generous way. So for me, it's very important that my projects like that. Yeah.
Maybe just to continue a bit about, of course, one of the amazing things about working with Joar is also because his installations create spaces for interaction, also where researchers and artists and the general public can participate. So for me, when I'm when I have access to these colonial archives, to these materials, like for instance the manuscript, right, is in the special manuscript collection at the Royal Library, and you need a special card to get access to it, and etc. etc. So these, all these kind of institutional barriers to accessibility and accessibility of knowledge, not only like physically and practically, but also of course in terms of kind of disciplinary traditions, right? There are so much in place, and I think we are reproducing them kind of all the time through just academic habits, that we don't create context for people to like literally touch or metaphorically kind of be touched and be part of these ways. So to me, to work with, to meet Joar quite a few years ago and to kind of participate in the Girigumpi project, it's also been a way to try to think through, who are we researching for? What formats do we make and write and think our research, or kind of acknowledge as research? And how can we facilitate, even when we are part of these kind of colonial institutions with long kind of histories of caring for, but in a care way that is often not very careful for communities. How can we find ways to change these systems? And I think there, universal practice in his way of thinking of space, and space of disagreements and space of coming together, has been deeply influential to my practice in general, to the way I think of publishing, which languages you speak and write in, and where to kind of circulate your knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you both. Pierre, I think there's some questions in the chat.
Yes, Caroline, did you want to ask a quick question, maybe?
Oh, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you to all three speakers for such sharing, such wonderful knowledge and wonderful images as well. I mean, they're magnificent, really, both ancient and modern ones. So thank you very much. I wanted to ask three of you, and maybe, I don't know, Pierre, who maybe, who may have a more the mind of an historian, rather, if in these northern representations of colonizations that we see in Hogarth and his predecessors and those who imitated him afterwards, I mean, there may be also a legacy of representations of other colonizations. I was very much struck by, for example, as scholar of English things, I've been, of course, working very much with my students when I was still teaching on John Smith, on Théodore de Brie, on all these, incredible representations of in the case of John Smith, the colonization of Virginia, which were commissioned not by the king, but by, commercial companies. I mean, the idea was to prove that Virginia was such a wonderful world that you would like to export your family and your, which some people did and some didn't. But anyway, so these pictures are really incredible. I'm sure most of you know them, and I wonder whether there are really reverberations from the John Smith's world between the John Smith's worlds in of Virginia and the world of the Sámis. I wonder. I mean, is it possible that Hogarth, who was then a very young artist, a very young engraver at the time, is it possible that he may have been in touch with this kind of material that was accessible, I suppose, in England? So I'm asking the real Hogarthians among you, if that's just possible.
I mean, thank you for that question, because I think it's a very important one. I think he was definitely aware of those. I mean, the link is like Bernard Picard, of course, because Picard was influenced to represent like customs and religious habits of like all the nations of the so-called known world. Actually drew from Théodore de Brie and drew from like existing literature. So these images were definitely circulating at the time. I would say though, and especially in comparison with Picard and like with some of those images, especially of like South America, which are meant to just like exoticize bodies and territories and make them look like more dangerous than they actually were. I think in the case of Hogarth's depiction of Sápmi, we are more contemplating something that is on the Arcadian trope, like presenting the population and the locality as some sort of like idealistic territory in which like, that is a sort of like New Arcadia. That's something that you find also in the very lengthy chapter of La Motrée, in which he described those territories, making metaphors and comparisons with Greece, with like Virgil, and which might actually, the text is very interesting to compare with the image, because like Hogarth isolated certain elements that he found like the most picturesque, shall we say. There is another element that is included in another plate that is just a stone that was found in a mine in Sápmi. And it's like the literature that was produced, like what La Motrée is describing is half like a sort of Arcadian description of the land and half a usable report of like what you can actually found in Sápmi and where you can actually invest, because the book itself was also published and like there were subscribers to this book. So there was a wide range of interests that I think he was trying to satisfy in his descriptions. So that's a very long answer for your question. So, but I think Hogarth was definitely aware of those prints, if not directly, at least through Picard, who had started, I mean, he was starting to publish this thing at the very same moment. So I think those images were circulating, definitely. And beyond that, I think it should definitely be studied more in comparison with the text that has this sort of ambivalence.
Mm. Thank you. Yes, I was struck, but because the John Smith images are also very Arcadian, because the idea was to lure, right, colonizers into this magnificent utopian country, and the community of the local people is represented in very pacified way, and there is this kind of, yes, also a little bit of a utopian touch about it. So it's the analogy was a bit striking. Thank you very much, Pierre.
All right, I think that since we're way past the time that we initially intended, I will just wrap up by thanking everyone for attending, and especially our two guests for their generous talks and sharing their ideas. It was a pleasure to meet the two of you, and I think we will have some further conversations.
Yes. Thank you all. It's really wonderful conversation, which does need to continue. I agree, Pierre.
Thank you very much for inviting.
Yeah, thanks so much.